There you go.
Tanzanita Demtek. My name is Cathy Richardson, and my Cree name is Kinu Isqueyu. And I am here with Nichola Watson, and I'm on traditional unceded Abenaki territory in southern Quebec. And yeah, we're doing an interview podcast on Nicola's recent work. A million years ago, I taught her at City University, and she's been doing her master's. And since then, she's been continuing her research and writing books. And we're exploring the topic of Black women's health, the intersections of racism and suicide. Welcome, Nicola. Would you like to introduce yourself, tell us where you are, and then get into catching us up with what you've been working on?
Oh, thank you, Doc. I like to call you Doc. That's like the formal. But thank you, Cathy, for talking to me. I'm coming from Victoria, BC, which is with the Sanic or the Kwangwing speaking peoples. And it's my pleasure to be speaking with you. What have I been doing? A lot, one of which is an extension of my thesis research graduate studies that where I met you, and you've had such an amazing influence on my continued learning from you as an instructor. And so I'd looked at Black women and the intersections between racism and suicide, looking at a broader framework from white supremacy violence as the core umbrella. And so I completed my thesis, and I thought I needed to continue this research because it's invaluable information. And so that's where I'm at now that I've completed it, and now I'm thinking about how to present it. And so I'm talking to you to get some ideas because you've been doing this work in your own way in different communities.
Well, that sounds really amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings and what you've been learning about this topic?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, in the Black community, I grew up in Jamaica and I came to Canada in my adolescent years, and racism is a thing. So when we talk about racism, it's more colorism that I observed as a child. So lighter pigmentation, darker and lighter skinned people getting more advantages, not necessarily earned. But in terms of suicide as a child in Jamaica, I never heard of it. So when I came to Canada, I started learning about suicide, but it wasn't really discussed in the Black community. Or if I overheard any conversation, it was more about, oh, well, other communities, because Black people don't do that stuff. You know, if you end your life, as I was overhearing in these adult conversations I was eavesdropping, it was more, if you killed yourself, you're going to a place called hell. And I was like, oh my goodness. So this suicide thing must be really negative. And so I started to really inquire more and more. And then I got to my graduate research. I knew a lot of information around racism because I endured it here in Canada, especially with the N word from adults and students alike. I grew up in Toronto, and I went to really specific community events to learn more about myself, and people teaching me racial socialization, really what to expect, how to engage, how to behave, and how to get what I need or want as a Black woman in white supremacy spaces, right? And
Wow.
so I knew the racial component, but I still couldn't make the connection between racism and suicide. And so I got the opportunity to do so at City U to really search the data to see if there is any connection. And what I found was absolutely, especially historically, when you think about the enslaved or the captive Africans before they got onto ships. So we understand colonization and different forces that really colonized the African people one of which was white people or Europeans, if you want to call it that. And my research really looks at the white perspective, in terms of from Africa to the different places in the world, especially Jamaica, Canada, and United States. And what I found was people ended their lives before they got onto ships, at different ports in on the continent of Africa while they were on it. So they jumped to their deaths.
Yeah.
And when they landed, not just individually, but in groups, right? This occurred that they ended their lives. And so different African groups, they had different meanings as to the ending of their lives, like, see, in terms of a better place, because hello, Earth wasn't being so kind to them. And
Yeah.
so they thought, different perspectives around ending their lives, but one was they would reunite with their families in the afterlife.
Mhm.
And jumping to now, in terms of present day, most of the research that in terms of statistics, came out of the United States because they've been tracking this information. In Canada, nothing. I couldn't find like a database. I could find articles, and that was more like personal testimonies. Similarly, in Jamaica, they're now starting to do some research. But what I found in the literature in the American data is that, specifically around Black women, is that absolutely they end their lives, but not to the same degree as other groups,
Yeah.
specifically white women and people of color, but they do attempt suicide at the highest rate. So there's some stuff going on there, around racism in the United States and some other factors that are leading. And so I've one part of my research looks at the risk factors and the preventative factors.
Hmm. So one of the things that I'm thinking about when you're talking is, of course, history and context and colonialism. They set the stage for a lot of human interaction on the planet, but also like in terms of response-based analysis, which is what I'm involved in, and you as well. That it it's not just an isolated or individual act of violence or adversity that hurts us. It's all the negative social responses that we receive afterwards when we tell someone, when we turn to authorities, when we are telling friends sometimes, that we can often be blamed. The violence can be minimized. We can be told that we deserved it or we made bad choices, all sorts of things. And so when that really compounds, like time after time, Black, racialized, Indigenous people receive negative social responses
Mhm.
in society, um, it can really kill a person's hope or faith that things could ever get better. And so I'll ask you a bit to talk about that, but I want to point to something that really caught me, and that was that you went to some courses in community and they were teaching you, were talking about how to navigate through white supremacy with white people to get what you need. I don't want you to give away your resistance strategies, of course, but can you just say something about that? Like, I think a lot of listeners will be surprised that you actually have to think about this in advance, plan how you're going to talk to a white person in authority, plan how you present yourself, like what discourse is, um, perhaps put them in the position of the benevolent benefactor or the charitable person. Yeah, I just think that that's so interesting because I think so many people don't realize that they actually contribute to putting Black people in a position where they have to do stuff like that.
Absolutely. I mean, the racism that I encountered, really the direct racism, started as a child, as a teenager here in Canada. I lived in Toronto for quite some time before moving to BC in 2000. So I was raised, and I went to school, middle school and high school in Ontario, Toronto specifically. And wow, like it's not just children, it's adults saying really stupid stuff, racial stuff. And particularly, I had no idea what the N word meant, the double G word. And people were just calling me that. People, strangers, I didn't know them. People were using the N word at me, kids at school or on the bus, or, adults, I'm in a mall and all of a sudden I'm like, whoa. I think the greatest, schools are supposed to be safer spaces. And when I was in high school, I remember so many of my white teachers being racist, but in subtle ways. And I was getting sick, literally. When you talk about a racial injury, race-based injuries that affects the mental, right? How I could function in school. And I think my mom noticed it. And
Mm.
I was signed up for a Saturday school, and it was taught by Yafa. I remember Leslie Yafa, a graduate student at sorry, not UVic. What am I thinking about UVic? Um, what York University in Toronto. This is culturally a Jewish woman and a Black student, Andrea Brown. And they got together and they created this kind of like Saturday school for Black youth. It was amazing.
Wow.
And not only were we learning about this place called Africa, like, okay, ancestors, who are they? I actually met a Black princess. I was like, they exist? Like, amazing. I was just like floored. And then we learned a lot more about more African pride, how we should really be more about self-confidence, but also because we had scenarios of events that were occurring, they were really helpful in terms of, okay, these events are happening. You cannot control the fact that they're happening to you. So we want you to understand that you need to strategize around how you respond to people, so it doesn't continue to be detrimental to your health. But you get some things out of that. So a lot of the times, even now, so the roles are reversed now that I receive a lot of Black people into my practice, especially Black youth. Um, and they're telling me these things, and I'm like, okay, these race-based things that are occurring. And then one of my primary role is to say, okay, I see you, I hear you, and I want you to heal from this. First of all, the internalize, because I know what that means to internalize violence. Now we're going to work from the inner core to externalize things because you didn't cause this. And most
Yeah.
often, the narrative is from some people, even adults, I can't understand how people could do these things to me because of my Black skin. And then I have to reverse that and be like, actually, it wasn't because of your Black skin, it's because they're racist.
Yeah.
And explore that. So yeah, I had to literally go through that racial socialization and understand what that meant to me as a child, and then applying that now as an adult, as a clinician. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the work you've been doing in telling young people, no, this is not something wrong with you. It's not even inside you. It exists in the social world, like obviously in between people. And the reason it exists is that some people choose to be racist
Yeah.
and they target you. But it's about them and it's about their privilege and what they can get away with. It's not about you. And if I can share another example in an Indigenous context. So, Amnesty International did some reports on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And one was called something about stolen sisters, and the second one was no more stolen sisters. And they attributed the problem to the fact that Indigenous women are vulnerable. And I really took offense to that because I
Me
know so
too.
many Indigenous women who are really strong and proud to be Indigenous women. The fact that I'm an Indigenous woman is not the problem.
Yeah.
Me, the problem is that there's enough people in Canada, mostly men, obviously,
Mhm.
who are willing to use violence against Indigenous women. That they're willing, they make a decision to target us, to hurt us and to take what it is that they can get. And they know there's relative impunity, like there's a really low likelihood that they'll get caught.
Mhm.
That's the problem,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we need to
Absolutely.
name the problem accurately, and then
Yes.
we can start to say, like you're doing, that there's nothing wrong with you. Like you're beautiful, right?
Yeah.
um this is something out in the world that's sick.
Yes. You're so right. And I mean, Amnesty International should know better.
Of course.
Like, you don't blame the victim. Like, who is writing that stuff, right? And the response-based practitioner would be like, look at how you're languaging stuff.
Yeah.
Right? This is inappropriate. You're blaming the victim. Look at white men and their behaviors, as you said, and hold them accountable and name them as the problem with people with power abusing their power who are, in fact, racist too, right?
Yeah, and I did talk to people about it, and they said it was a strategic decision because if they wrote on the report, like white men in Canada are the problem, then people wouldn't read the report. So,
Which, well, no.
but it's similar to some of the anti-harassment trainings
Yes.
that we see at our universities, and
Mhm.
and one of the things they do is they try to teach so-called victims about consent. So
Yeah.
like this is not about consent. It's not about me, not knowing how to give consent or how to withhold it. It's that perpetrators, uh they know that you have boundaries and they violate them on purpose. And
Yes.
so we have to hold the perpetrators accountable, and so not direct these trainings to the people that could be victims, and kind of like teach them to not be victims.
Yeah.
It's wrong-headed, and
Yeah.
anyway, I appreciate that that power message that you're giving to young people. Like you're fine, you're beautiful, but
Yeah.
you do need to learn how to navigate this so that you get hurt as infrequently as possible, and that you support your brothers and sisters and cousins, and that we try to create as much safety as possible together, right?
Absolutely. It's critical. You got it, Doc. And going back to so that's one part of the question you asked. And then the second part was about the historical context, right?
Yeah.
Around stigma and so forth. And of course, when we look at suicide in a broader African perspective, we need to think about how we got to Canada, meaning African people, Black people, or to different parts of the world. And that it wasn't a vacation. We weren't going on vacation, right? We are historically an enslaved group of people. And one colonizer was the Europeans, or white people is how I'm going to call them in this conversation. So, white supremacy violence. They went to Africa, looked at Africa as a continent, and went, hey, we want what you have, and we're not going to ask for it. We're just going to take it. And in the process of taking it, we're going to rape your people, we're going to kill some people, and we're going to take some of you. We're going to kidnap, not take. We're going to kidnap some of you and take you to different parts of the world. When I look at suicide within the African enslaved captive people. So they began to engage, and different scholars talk about this, right? Before they got onto slave ships, during the voyagers, and then when they were on land. And it wasn't just individually ending their lives, it was also in the group, in groups, that they would end their lives. So, different parts of the United States, when they got there, everybody from the ships went into different lakes or water bodies and they drowned. They were like, no, we're not going to do this. And that's after they were shackled together on ships and then on land. When I looked at the preventative factors, we know from the data that connectedness, community, religious life, so many other things are critical to the African people, but Black people in general, whether you're looking at the African context or now, more on different continents, right? So those were critical to them before they got onto the boat. And those were the things that were impacted, because we know that enslavement, part of that was taking people to different parts of the world, the separation of families, raping women and men publicly sometimes to say, hey, we want to teach you a lesson or we want to teach you lessons. So, but specifically, if I could go to more the religious, spiritual aspect, right? So the enslaver understood the value of, African spiritual life, the meaning of that, the power of that, and they really operationalized that, right? In the sense of, okay, so they noticed, so if enslavement was about economic profit, so they needed a labor force, right, to get people to work, well, you're going to try to keep them alive. You don't want them to die, especially when you're taking out the best. Well, the African leaders, some of them were really in on this too. They sold their best, strongest people because they made money. So sometimes we don't understand that there were tribal things going on the continent with enslavement of different groups of people, right? But here they were on different, boats and things like that. And the colonizers really paid attention and went, okay, so you value family, but you also value spiritual life. So we're gonna look at that in terms of suicide, and we're gonna make sure that because you value, you're going to end your lives anyway. So they started to end their lives. And then the colonizer went, well, we don't want you to do that. We want to keep you alive. And how do I explain this? There's this notion of, okay, African belief that if you end your life, it needed to be, your body needed to stay intact. And then you can reunite with your whomever in the afterlife. And the colonizers really understood that. So they started decapitating um, people when they ended their lives, to say to the rest of the people, look at that. They're not going to go to this place called wherever heaven in the afterlife because they're doing that. So that was an issue to keep them alive, not a concern about the mental health of the people, but we want to keep you alive so we can profit economically from you. So that's
Yeah.
the history, right? And then we get to today, where a lot of Black people still go, well, I don't want to, of course, I don't want anyone to end their life. So let me clarify. Nobody, especially us in our work, want anyone to end their lives.
Yes, of
But
course.
what the discourse around, if I kill myself, I'm going to go to hell, that's from colonized, that's from the white man's teaching, right? Or you're criminalized or you're stigmatized. Weak people, especially Black women, weak people end their lives without looking at the psychological pain, and that this is an extreme way of problem solving. You're not well, right? And so let's take care of you, right, with some resources and community and etc. But what we have instead today is, the strong Black woman. That's a huge risk factor of suicide as well, because they needed to be strong for the white people during enslavement. They needed to have 10 or more children to produce economically. And if you didn't, you weren't strong, you were weak. We continued that practice into today where Black women are, we are strong. So we're not going to talk about, what's going on with us. We're going to keep it to ourselves. And because there's this idea of stigma around mental health, and I think that's in every community, but in my research, definitely in the Black community, and I've witnessed that personally, where you must be crazy. You need to go to the madhouse if you're hearing voices and stuff like that. But getting back to the religious component of today, it's really about, or the spiritual component, it can be protective in the sense of it reunites you. You get to be among community, and in some churches you're cared for. It becomes or community as well, it becomes a risk factor because the Black church, and this is a generalization today, continues on the sin factor, right? So if you are thinking about suicide, so we're not even planning suicide yet, if you are even having thoughts, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And why would you want to end your life? Because God gave you life. He's the only one who could take it away, but without considering the psychological well-being of people. So it's both a risk factor and preventative factor, spiritual
Mhm.
life.
Wow, thanks for sharing all this. I have a few reflections, and I'm learning a lot here. So you made me think about fascism. So in a fascist state, the state and the prison guards want to control when you live or die. You're not allowed to make those decisions for yourself, right? Even if they're hurting you. And you're talking about the economic factors, for example, having lots of children. And it made me again turn to this idea that Indigenous suffering in Canada is one of the biggest businesses. And I did write a paper with some great women from the Yukon, and in that paper we spelled out how much money is made by lawyers, psychologists, psychiatrists, child protection workers, uh, police salaries, all the money that's made on managing Indigenous suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's astronomical. Yeah.
Wow.
So, the most of the people that are the workers in those fields are non-Indigenous, and especially
Yes.
in the north of Quebec, for example, you go there and it feels really, really colonial in ways that it doesn't feel quite so much in the city, for example. You go up there and almost all the services are run by non-Inuit people, and it, it's shocking and startling. So I'm just picking up on these ideas
Mm-hmm.
of like who gets to make money off this, who
Yeah.
decides if we live or die, and what does that mean for our own extended families? You're talking about strong Black women, like matriarchs,
Mm-hmm.
and how they're so people are so afraid of them that they have to stigmatize them and accuse them of being mentally ill,
Yeah.
pathologize their resistance, and the things they do to advocate for their children, for example. Do you want to just pick up on that theme of strong
Yeah.
women and resistance?
Oh, yes. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, I observe that colonial factor a lot against Indigenous people in different environments, especially here on Vancouver Island. And I remember writing a paper for your course talking about the workers and how, in this space, it was about addictions program, right? And I confronted them and I said, look, you're taking all these Indigenous folks to white people resorts, whatever you want to call them. How about you look into Indigenous services? And they were offended. And I said, how about we create a lens around the Indigenous people that we're working with? They didn't have one, they didn't know what I was talking about, like the framework. I mean, I didn't know what I was talking about either, but I knew something had to be done in terms of how they were operating. And they got offended. And soon afterwards, I was let go from that organization without cause. So I should be silent, right? And so that happens, when we talk about the structural racism. And I've seen it a lot in terms of the money that they
Mhm.
make, as you were talking about the different people who benefits from indigenous sufferings, as you noted. And it's very similar when we think about the economics of the captivity of Black people. And now we get to today where Black people are like, we need reparations, and people are like, nah, that happened a while ago. Well, you're here because of the suffering sufferings of our people. So yes, right? And the economics, when you talk about specifically Black women and their bodies that were put on the line being raped, continuously, no control over their reproductive system, but also when we think about when we think today about sexually transmitted diseases, whoa, you know, condom wasn't necessarily around during that time. So what were the white men giving to, Black women? And then we talk about developmentally, like babies, when we talk about trauma, right, inside the womb and then out, Black women had no say over how they raise their children. So it's not just the economic cost, which is huge, but also the mental cost of
Mhm.
what white supremacy did to Black women and their bodies and generations afterward. And I'm all for reparation today.
Mhm. Yeah, how do you repair a torn body part, from a
Exactly.
violation? I mean, there's so much that we could say about this, and we don't wanna get, too, distressing for people, but just on a simple systemic note, we know that most Indigenous mothers,
Mhm.
Black mothers, Indigenous mothers in Quebec and in almost every other province in Canada are more likely to be targeted by child welfare and have
Mm.
their children taken away. And, lots of explanations and reasons are sort of put on paper,
Yeah.
but they come from this kind of attitude that you're talking about of like who's superior in society, who's inferior, how we stigmatize people, how we talk about what mothering should look like. And yeah, it's wrong. Like it's a violation of the rights of the children, of the rights of the mother, but actually I don't think mothers have very many rights in society. We hear about the father's rights movement.
Hmm.
Never heard about the mother's rights movement. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it's a little part of white feminism or something, but um yeah, there's so much so many of these forces that really attack the family, but also attack mothering and cause great hardship for children. Children have to start looking after each other in
Hmm.
certain ways because just as a way to resist um
Yeah.
this kind of mistreatment in the society, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's the indigenous women and the Black women, we share so many things, right,
Mhm.
in terms of being colonized by white supremacy. And here in Canada, it's been nasty, right, in terms of what's been done on their own land. And when we look at, you know things that are happening in the world today, I'm like, you haven't even solved or addressed some things here at home, yet we're giving billions to the world. And I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but let's look at home first, right? And let's look at the fact that this is a white supremacist patriarchal society. And the list of bell hooks just listed so perfectly for us. And when we think of indigenous communities, and as you were talking about the children who are targeted, but also this mothering aspect and white superiority, the lens of we know what's best for you and we're going to control you in specific ways. And I've been following a few cases because they only report, some things. And then with social media, I love social media because people can actually put out their stories. So I've been following a few where, in remote communities, they're sharing a lot more about how the MCFD is what we call them here in BC across Canada comes in, assumes that these women can take care of their kids, Indigenous primarily, and then take them away. Don't give you these are the reasons you're doing these things. Like, do they actually do that to white women? I want to know. I want to know if they actually do that to white women in our hospitals, right? Oh, you're not doing these things, or you appeared, you're displaying these. No, it's completely racist. They know what they're doing, they're intentional, and they don't care because they have the structure, the white supremacist structure that protects them. They're making money from this, whomever they are in their roles as, I say the KKK in white uniform, the medical practitioners, the social workers, they all get to make money and go home while they disrupt Indigenous families. And it's similar in the Black community when it comes to MCFD or the ministry,
Yeah.
extremely racist. And then that's when they talk about deporting children. And I'm like, are you serious? How do you get from protecting to deporting? And a whole host of stuff. But moms are criminalized or they're stigmatized, Black women, and the Indigenous women, it's been ongoing, right? Since contact has been made with white supremacy. And I think we need to talk about it. I talk about it that way, and I don't care what white people think. I'm not invested in how white supremacy responds to me, right? I'm invested in the fact that we need to change some stuff while we're here on Earth, and to do whatever I can to address the issue, name the issue, and say, get the F out of my way if you're not going to do that, right?
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to put this out into public conversational spaces. And I'm reflecting on what you were sharing about the group suicides before, on departure and on arrival on Turtle Island, and how that's been completely left out of the historical account. I mean, I didn't even know that. And so again, who benefits from leaving these truths
Mhm.
out of our history? And so we need to say the hard things.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just admire your courage in being able to do that, like talking truth to power and saying, okay, I don't care how you respond, because that's a way we protect ourselves too. And sometimes we do need to just like step away from social media or wherever the attacks occur, and do what we can to nurture ourselves and our families. And it's all about safety and dignity, right?
Yeah. That's a huge part of it. I remember, actually, I think it was you and Alan Wade and some other response-based practitioners who spoke about safety and dignity together. That's where I kind of put the two together. Even though I was learning about safer spaces before. And it's so critically important because a lot of people, as you said, don't connect how we that group suicide or the knowledge. But then we know also from response-based practice is who's controlling the information, who's writing it. And back in the day, right, well, we weren't allowed to learn anything as in Black folks,
Yeah.
because that was a strategy of oppression. You don't need to know anything because if you get too smart, you're going to do some things. Well, we got here, we're here, and we're doing some stuff. And so many people, they've been doing, even without that academic knowledge, they've always been resisting in their own ways, right? Storytelling, group gathering, the church. So when the white people said, hey, you can't worship with us, Black people are like, that's okay, because we have our own way of doing it. So we're going to meet down by the river
Yeah.
and we're going to do our stuff, but we're going to exchange some information and strategize to kill some of you and take back, so revolts happened, right? So who's writing our stories and a whole host of things. I should say that when it comes to the Canadian enslavement of Black people, Canada didn't actually go to the continent and purchase people. They got people from through like the United States or the Caribbean. So it was kind of like not a direct link. But once Black people got to Canada, especially when we think of Black women, well, let's go back even further. Canadians with different economic backgrounds, because they were noticing that the enslavement, the economic benefit of enslavement, they said, well, we want them here too. Everybody owned Black people in Canada, like different economic backgrounds. So it wasn't just rich people, but who gave the consent to import? We must really go back to that. And that was the monarch, the royal British or France, can't remember who it was, that okayed um, the sale and the maintenance of Black people in Canada, right? And then Black people got here, and when we think about Black women on their bodies, rape was rampant in Canada, and people owned Black women and said, you belong to me, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to violate, I'm going to continue the violations, right? And so we had thousands of people in Canada in different places, and there are grave sites of enslaved people here in Canada. CBC they've been doing a lot of reporting about enslavement in Canada, right? And so they've done a really awesome job. But we were here, we were enslaved, we were executed publicly. We, as in African people, were raped, we were demeaned, we added to the economy, and it wasn't maintained not because white people didn't want to continue to own Black people. It wasn't maintained because Canada didn't have the environment. So it didn't have the warmer climate to produce. At the time, it was more crops that the enslavers were producing. So work the land, and as you know, Canada, we have seasons. Summer only lasts for 4 to 6 months, so it wasn't a big profit here. So they went from field laborers. Some Black people escaped to the United States, and we forget that the underground ran from both countries, right? They escaped and to the West Indies and so forth. And some said, send me back to Africa. So some people went back, but some people stayed. And those people then were indentured slaves. So these people still weren't making any money. Somebody profited, Black people weren't, right? And so it's an interesting dialogue. And also, people ended their lives here in Canada too. If we think of so many people who were escaping, even though I couldn't find data on like official data, we could find stories of people ending their lives here in Canada as well. Yeah.
Wow, so your work is really, well, you could call it suicide prevention, but it's about liberation, right? It's about emancipation. It's about creating the conditions inside in a society in which people would really like to live. Like, this feels like home. I can have a sense of belonging here. I can be in community with my brothers and sisters and others. And so that's the social project, right? Do you
Absolutely.
want to just talk a little bit about the trainings that you're developing? Because I know you're developing anti-racism and suicide prevention trainings, and
Yeah.
soon they'll be available. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so because of this ongoing research, I basically compiled everything into sort of like a book. And part of the research looks at suicide in terms of assessment, prevention, risk factors, and etc. Of course, I couldn't find any tool around that was created for Black people by Black people. But
Mm.
I looked to doctors Wixer and Gone, and they're indigenous. And I could give the complete names later on. I can't think of their first names. And they looked at prevention intervention in indigenous communities, with specifically on their own communities and elsewhere. And they talked about some specific things about moving from individual to more collective frameworks, moving away from pathologizing to actually looking at the agency of the people you're working with. So really, about safety and dignity, right? So looking at the people you're working with and try to move away from Eurocentric models. And this idea that you also explained about who are the people in charge or running these systems, it's just essentially white people in positions of power using white frameworks on indigenous communities. And here I'm thinking about, well, I don't want those white frameworks to be used on Black people. We're
Mhm.
different, we're unique, we come with our own experiences. There are some similarities, of course, when we talk about, the sense of community, right? Access to resources, barriers, and so forth. We share some common things. So I've been doing this research, and I thought I want to share it with other people to present the information to see what else can I explore, and to have people ask me some questions because I may have missed some stuff here. And so that's my hope, is to get the information out into the world, so people are asking some really using, intersectional lenses, racialized, the Black feminist, not just feminist theory, but Black feminist and Afrocentric, theory around how to really look and help, or I don't know if help is the right word, but how to meet Black women, especially where they're at. So care professionals are providing optimal care to them, right? And where they also feel safe, right? So can they go into certain environments and have this sense of safety, because that's an issue. A lot of Black women, I would imagine indigenous women, don't trust they don't trust white practitioners, openly, because of the history of abuse in terms of structural medical racism. And we understand that both, indigenous communities and Black, especially women in particular, sterilization, right, forced medical procedures are known to them, and we could list them. So we have Black women, they have reasons not to trust, but I want that to be where to have conversations with care professionals
Mhm.
around specifically racism and suicide, linking both in terms of our work.
Mhm. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, a while back people were doing network mapping. Do you remember that? Community network mapping, and they'd map out all these buildings. And I was thinking, no, we need to map out, identify the buildings where you're going to be treated with dignity. What this is like, not just an anti-racism zone, but this is like a Black woman, Indigenous woman appreciation zone, like really create the positivity and the sense of welcome. And if we were to do that kind of mapping, we'd find that we still have a long way to go. And I just really honor your commitment to making this place, this world, better and safer and even more beautiful for beautiful Black women.
Thank you so much, and for the opportunity to share this. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you further.
Thank